Yeah, this is presentation 4 from Unit 6 on Reconstruction. Okay, as the picture shows, the devastation in the South was pretty bad. This is a southern city after the war, and a lot of southern cities looked like this. On your notes, you have the following graphic. You can see the economic costs of the war. We've already talked about the loss of life. See, the Union spent $6.1 billion. Inflation in the North reached 80%. When you come to write your essay, what you'll see is that while inflation did reach 80%, the effect of the Civil War on the Northern economy is going to be largely a positive one and transformative. The effect on the Confederacy is devastating. Confederacy spent $2 billion. You can see by the end of the war, Confederate money was worthless. Inflation had reached 9,000%. As we talked about in the last presentation, by the end of the war, the tactics of Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman were designed to bring the South to its knees. Well, we have a problem. The Constitution didn't help us when states tried to leave the Union, and so there's no surprise that it doesn't help us when it came to readmit states to the Union. The big question was who was going to be in charge. Abraham Lincoln felt that he would like to be in charge. Obviously, Republicans in Congress felt the same way. The other question was exactly what was the status of the southern states. As far as Lincoln was concerned, they had never really left the Union. They were in a state of rebellion. Some radical Republicans, though, believed that they had left the Union and needed to be completely reformed. So we have two stages in Reconstruction. The first one is presidential Reconstruction. So we start with Lincoln's plan. It's known as the 10% plan because of one of the key points in it. Lincoln's plan was to be very forgiving. In his second inaugural address, he had talked a lot about reconciliation and forgiveness. And his plan is known as the 10% plan. There was a general amnesty for pretty much all members of the Confederate States of America. The basic exemption was Confederate leaders, military leaders, political leaders could not vote or hold power. As far as Lincoln was concerned, once 10% of his southern state had sworn an oath of loyalty to the United States, they would be welcomed back into the Union. Think about that. 10% is an incredibly low number. Lincoln's plan didn't mention anything about slaves. Republicans in Congress were not happy about this, and radical Republicans going to pass what's called the Wade-Davis bill. This was a much more harsh version of Reconstruction, and it would have raised the percentage of Southerners that would have been required to have sworn an oath of loyalty. Lincoln did not sign this bill before the end of that session of Congress. And if a president doesn't sign a bill, it doesn't become law. It's not a veto, but it's known as a pocket veto. On April 14th, 1865, Lincoln was shot and killed. And so we really don't know exactly what Lincoln planned to do, especially towards the newly freed slaves. So the very important task of rebuilding the nation fell to Andrew Johnson. Strange guy to become a president, for the Republicans anyway. Andrew Johnson was a Southerner. He was a Democrat. He was the only Southern senator who didn't resign in 1860. He was from Tennessee. So every other senator resigned from Congress. So the two senators, for example, from Virginia would have left Congress. Andrew Johnson was the only one who didn't. Part of the reason was he hated the people who basically had engineered secession from the Union. He hated plantation owners. He hated the wealthy who controlled Southern politics. Very racist president. Eric Foner believes he's probably our most racist president. Johnson's plan, like Lincoln's, was pretty straightforward. A loyalty oath, kind of the same as Lincoln's. Amnesty for most Southerners. Now, this did exclude the leaders, just like it did in Lincoln's plan. Military and political leaders couldn't vote. Also, wealthy people, people worth more than $20,000, could not exercise any power in the new could not vote or hold power in southern states. The other condition was that states had to ratify the 13th Amendment. This is pretty easy, and southern states did it. Southern states quickly formed new governments. These governments, as far as Southerners were concerned, were moderate. And they were mainly led by people who had been Unionists in the late 1850s, but who had been shouted down by people who had wanted secession. But Houston, we have a problem. There were two problems. The first one is the big problem. Southern states, Southerners were very, very nervous about the 4 million former slaves that lived in the South. The 13th Amendment had freed them. The question was, what was their status? How were they going to live? Every southern state passed a set of laws that dealt with the newly freed slaves. These laws defined what rights African Americans had legally, state by state, and they also limited African Americans' freedom. And that's what they've become infamous for. Collectively, we call them black codes. Obviously, they differed from state to state, so Virginia's black codes would be different from Maryland's, would be different from Mississippi's, would be different from Louisiana's, would be different from Texas. The other problem was Andrew Johnson. Former Confederates were not allowed to vote or hold power. Also, wealthy people worth over $20,000 were not allowed to vote or hold power. Johnson, though, went about handing out pardons. If people came to him, begged forgiveness, he would issue a pardon, and Johnson liked this. It gave him a bit of a power trip. As a result, he pardoned most of the people that were not supposed to be in charge of the southern governments. As a result, when the southern states elected people to Congress, the people they elected looked alarmingly like the people who had served in the 1850s. In fact, they pretty much were. And Republicans in Congress were outraged when they came back from their mini vacation. Andrew Johnson claimed that Reconstruction had been solved. Unfortunately, the radical Republicans did not agree. At this point, I would like you to look at the Mississippi Black Codes and answer the questions. So you can pause the video here. Congress comes back and does not like what it sees. At the same time, there's violence, reports of violence in the South, attacks on newly freed slaves. Republicans in Congress pass two things. First, they extend the life of the Freedmen's Bureau. Freedmen's Bureau was a government agency designed to assist with freed slaves, and it also assisted other Southerners who needed help. A civil rights bill was also passed designed to protect the civil rights of African Americans in the South. So you can take a look here, and this gives you a little bit of information about the Freedmen's Bureau. Johnson vetoed both the bill to extend the Freedmen's Bureau and the Civil Rights Bill. For the first time in US history, the Republicans had enough votes in Congress to override the presidential veto. You need 2/3 votes to be able to do that. So Republicans reestablished the Freedmen's Bureau, and there were more reports of more violence in the South. At this point, Republicans figured out that they really needed to pass more than the law. They needed to amend the Constitution. As far as they were concerned, a law wasn't enough to protect African American rights because Andrew Johnson could veto it. So we have the 14th Amendment, an incredibly important amendment. This is the most important amendment in US history. The Supreme Court has used this amendment more than any other to decide cases. There are 3 sections to it. The one that's important to us is Section 1. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state, this is the important bit, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. Obviously, this amendment is aimed at African Americans. It makes them citizens, and it makes it clear that states cannot pass laws that are aimed at them. Things get ugly. Johnson started to publicly speak about how the government was a white man's government, and he goes around the country campaigning against the 14th Amendment. Radical Republicans are going to respond by doing something that they're going to do for about the next 40 or 50 years, and that is wave the bloody shirt and remind Northern voters that they need to vote for the Republican Party, not the Democrats, because the Democrats were the party of secession. The Democrats were the traitors during the Civil War. The 1866 elections were overwhelming victories for the Northern Republicans. At this point, Southern states continued to defy the Republicans in Congress. Tennessee was the only state that passed the 14th Amendment. Every other Southern state rejected it. At this point, Congress passes the Military Reconstruction Act in 1867. Johnson vetoed it. The Radical Republicans had enough votes to override Johnson's veto. The Military Reconstruction Act was a huge deal. It created 5 military districts. To be readmitted to the United States, Southern states had to do 2 things. They had to pass the 14th Amendment, and they had to organize a government that guaranteed African Americans could vote. If you look at this map, and actually we'll look at the map on the next page, it's a little bigger. It's the same map. It has the same information on it. There are 2 dates on the Southern states. The top date is the date when the state passed, ratified the 14th Amendment, and the bottom date in parentheses is the date that the Democrats regained control of the state. So that's the Military Reconstruction Act. You can see that we have 5 military districts. Northern soldiers are going to be stationed here. This is basically Northern Republicans forcing Southerners to do what they want, and that is to make new governments that are going to be acceptable to them, that are going to allow African Americans to vote and hold some political power and give African Americans some rights.